to share an update on the master plan IPT, the integrated project team, which is the group of VA subject matter experts from all over the department who are working together to implement our draft master plan. Today's update is going to be a little bit different from what I've done in the past with this group. I would like to move away from the paradigm where I provide information and this group of very influential and intelligent people sits quietly. And instead, what I'd like to do as I provide information, I also want to raise some challenges and questions, mostly questions that are going to need to be answered in the near to mid-range future, and ask this group to think about any recommendations or questions or conversations you believe might be appropriate in order to get those challenges met and those questions answered. So I am going to ask you to pay attention with the expectation that this will be more of a conversation than just me yammering at you. I'm going to cover several topics. I have notes, but as usual, I think I will ignore them. So wanted to talk a little bit about the work that the principal developer team has been doing around preparing a community plan as an input to our programmatic environmental impact study process. And I'll get into some details so you'll know what all those words mean together. Also want to talk about the optimistic title on the slide is Innovative Funding Opportunities. The flip side of that is funding challenges that our principal developer and other enhanced use leasing developers will face as some of the funding sources that are both available and in most cases necessary to carry out housing for homeless veterans and other individuals begins to dry up. Also want to talk about the initial planning we've been doing around the enterprise district, which is one of the zones in the draft master plan that frankly within the VA org chart doesn't really have an owner. And the good news is that means that those of us here at GLA can run with it without a program office in DC necessarily telling us what we can and can't do. So we're running with it. I also want to talk a little bit about the IG report that came out last September and our progress on implementing the recommendations. And then finally wanted to touch a little bit on what the Mission Act means or ideally doesn't mean for West LA and GLA as a whole. All right, there's too many words on this slide, so let me just talk to you about it. As I mentioned, we have asked the principal developer team to come up with a recommended community plan. Where will the housing be? How many units do they believe are feasible? Phased how? How much of it is adaptive reuse of existing buildings? How much of it should be new construction? All of that are preliminary recommendations and options with some sort of feasibility and very rough order of magnitude cost estimates associated with it, so that that information can feed into our PEIS process, so that in June, when we issue the record of decision that closes out that process, we do so informed by, in essence, a feasibility study about where the housing will be built. It is too early because we're not done with the PEIS and we have not issued a record of decision. It is tragically too early for me to share with you any of the details of that community plan because it would be presumptive to do so. I say tragic because the thing is so exciting and it really makes the work that we have set out for ourselves so real. To see experts who have built a lot of housing for homeless individuals, including homeless veterans around the Southern California area, telling us in great detail how they intend to do that on our campus, it's really exciting. So the minute we are at the right point in the process for us to begin to share their thoughts, we will. Paul McPherson, who is in charge of the department's EUL program, is in the back of the room. Paul, I ask you to stand up and look daggers at me if I get out ahead of anything. You don't have to stand up yet. But if I get too excited and start to share information that is not right to share, I'm hoping you'll keep me in check. It is exciting though, so I'm tempted. But among the things that the community plan looks at, as I said, are opportunities for adaptive reuse of buildings, which is a fancy word for renovating existing buildings, versus new construction. We've had presentations before this group before about those two things. And I do want to make sure that everybody in the room understands a couple of realities. Number one, before we can do anything that may in any way adversely impact a contributing element to the historic district that our campus is, we have to go through a process with the State Historic Preservation Office and with some consulting parties whose job is to ensure that we're going to properly mitigate the impact of those decisions. That's a lot of words. That means that even if we wanted to, even if it were the best, cheapest, fastest way to deliver housing, we cannot unilaterally bulldoze all the buildings on the North Campus. We wouldn't do that anyway, but I want folks in this room to understand that there are other stakeholders who have a very watchful eye on the decisions that we might make. I also want to point out that many of the buildings on the North Campus and some on the South Campus, including the one that we are all in right now, are seismically deficient, and so do require some sort of action to address the seismic deficiencies, whether that is repairing them. There's a concept also called repair by replacement, where you take something down and build another one. Anyway, we have an obligation to do something about the seismically deficient buildings. I'm bringing that up by way of saying that if somebody were to make the decision that the fastest and most cost-effective way to deliver housing is purely new construction, and I don't think we have any reason to believe that that's true, but even if it were, the government would have to find a way to correct those seismically deficient buildings, and there's a price tag associated with that that needs to be factored into the overall cost analysis. The one other thing I want to bring up about the decisions around adaptive reuse versus new construction is, as I said, the entire West LA campus and the federal building area and the cemetery are part of what's called the West Los Angeles Veterans Historic District. I think those are the right words. The entire campus is listed in the National Registry of Historic Places. Not every building is a contributing building, but many of them are. And that is due both to the age, frankly, of some of the buildings, but also to the fact that they were, many of them, part of the Pacific branch of the National Home for Disabled Volunteer Soldiers, and then the multiple generations of healthcare facilities that came in after that. So there is a rich history to this campus. Many of the buildings are architecturally fascinating, even if they weren't historic. And so as we bring our principal developer team onto the campus and they take a look at those buildings through the eyes of architects and visionaries, not just through the eyes of those of us who understand how expensive they have been to try to maintain, there is, I think, a lot of enthusiasm for attempting to reuse at least some of the buildings on the North Campus because of their beauty, their history, and the fact that, frankly, at the end of the day, that is going to be the faster and more cost-effective way to deliver housing. So, with that thought, I wanted to go through a couple of the questions that I think we collectively are going to need to tackle with the help and input of this group of veterans and other stakeholders, and of the folks on our principal developer team who have experience in designing and delivering housing for homeless. So one question that has come up, and I also want to share anecdotally one other thing that I've been doing. The executive leadership team of this hospital includes the chief of staff who's over all the physicians, the nurse executive who's over all the nurses. There's a leadership team to any hospital, and this hospital is just like those in that it has a leadership team. There's been an interesting dynamic over the years in which it's sometimes difficult for the folks whose job it is to run this hospital 24/7 to really wrap their heads in any way other than as a big concept around the master plan for the North Campus. If you work in this building, unless you're going to, both our IT department and some of our auxiliary functions are on the North Campus, but unless you're specifically heading there, if you work in this building, chances are you don't go north of Wilshire very often. And so one thing that I've been trying to do is really capture the hearts and minds of our clinical and administrative leaders around what's coming on the North Campus, because we need their ideas to inform what we're doing. Just as a for instance, we know for the 54 veterans who live in building 209 that their primary care often is in the emergency department here. Whether you're a formerly chronically homeless veteran or any other human being, most of us don't get sick between 9 and 5 Monday through Friday. That's just not how life works. And so we know that there are a lot of emergency department visits for folks living on the North Campus, and that it's harder than you would think to get from there to here. So one thing that we've been talking about with our clinical staff is what are the pros and cons, for example, of having an outpatient clinic, some sort of a primary care, maybe even more like a minute clinic, a small clinic that's embedded with the housing on the North Campus. And there are both pros and cons. Obviously, it's much more convenient for the veterans living on the North Campus to get to that clinical facility. But we also need to make sure that there is really good warm handoff both of information and of case management between any clinician who may be working on the North Campus and the clinicians who work out of this building. Shouldn't be hard because they all work for GLA and they're all on the same campus, and yet there's a difference between providing care in a hospital and providing care in another type of facility. So we need to be thinking through what are the pros and cons of providing a separate clinical location on the North Campus. There are legal issues too, in that if we lease a building through the enhanced use leasing program to a developer and a service provider to provide housing, by law, VA cannot lease back its own property from that leaseholder. So you sort of have to figure out from a legal perspective, where would you put that clinical building since we can't lease it back? We'll figure that out. That's a problem for lawyers, and lawyers can get pretty clever when there's an obvious right answer. So anyway, there's that question. But then there's also the question of how do we decide who the veteran tenants are living in a particular building or cluster of buildings. So whereas it might be easier for the case management services offered in a particular building if every veteran living in that building were at sort of the same place in his or her recovery from a substance abuse perspective or a mental health perspective, or even in their sort of personal development in terms of how many years they've been no longer living on the street. It's probably easier if everybody in the building is similarly situated, but it's probably not as good in terms of the clinical outcomes for the veterans, because at least some of the experts have told me that there is value in having a recently chronically homeless individual see around him or her peers who are at a later stage in their recovery. So how do we square those things? How do we decide? It's also, frankly, tough for some of our clinicians when the acuity level, the need for care, the medical fragility in any particular patient population is too high. And so sort of blending acuity makes it easier from a clinical service delivery perspective. These are all questions that we need to ask and answer about the community that we're building. We are building it one building at a time, but we need to integrate it all into a neighborhood, a true community. So we need to ask and answer these questions thoughtfully. And so I would put it to this group and to the members of the public who are sitting here listening today, provide us your input about that. There are lots of perspectives, and every one of them is more expert, frankly, than mine. This is not my field. I know how to ask questions, but we're going to need your help to answer them thoughtfully. Another question that has come up, interestingly, as I was briefing the executive leadership team, a member of that team said, who's going to be the mayor of this new community? It's an interesting question, and it's probably one that has many possible answers and has been answered in the context of other developments for homeless. There are various models for self-governance. Some of them probably more familiar to veterans who lived through various types of self-governance, perhaps in base housing or in other aspects of their military service. But again, it's a question that has multiple potential answers, and I would like to think that we can approach it thoughtfully for the benefit of the veterans who will be living in the community that we are building. Another question near and dear to my heart, as I have said since I came into this role, a master plan never housed anybody. So the quicker we can evolve from talking about what we're doing in terms of the master plan to calling it a name that is evocative, that is inspiring, that is that causes people to aspire to living there, that honors their service, that honors the history of the campus. The quicker we can get to that name or names, I would envision an overall name and then perhaps names for smaller communities within it. But the quicker we can figure out what approach to veteran and other stakeholder engagement is appropriate to develop that name, frankly, the happier I will be, because I want to be able to talk about this in a term that means more to somebody who made someday live there than the draft master plan. And then another question that has come up, and this is one that we would very much appreciate your input into. It's a harder question than it ought to be, and that has to do with policing and security on the campus. Ordinarily, in any kind of VA facility that is associated with a healthcare facility, the security on the campus is provided by the VA police, and that has historically been the case here. However, our enhanced use leases generally refer to community policing by the municipal, the LA city or city PD, LAPD, or the LA County Sheriff. Interestingly, but not surprisingly, those bodies, LAPD and the LA County Sheriff, are hesitant to want to take on the role of being first responders on this campus because, frankly, the VAPD are located here. They can get here faster. And that's not a role that the local law enforcement bodies have been asked to carry out before. So we need to do some negotiation with them to see if we can't move them to a position in which they are more willing to perform that role. But if we can't, for whatever reason, then we're going to need to figure out how to plus up the VAPD so that they can provide effective law enforcement for more than 1,200 residents on the North Campus, while also providing effective security and law enforcement for the healthcare facility. So just additional sort of thinking to rise to a challenge. Next, I want to talk about funding. And we have seen both opportunities and the flip side of opportunities, challenges. The package of funding that any enhanced use leasing developer needs to come up with is complicated. For those of you who may not have sat in on any of our presentations before, the money that is used to redevelop a VA asset into housing is not VA money. It's not federally appropriated dollars. It is a mix of private and other public sector funding that the developer secures, and then the developer over time pays itself back through the vouchers and other stipends and rent paid by the residents. In Los Angeles, in the last couple of years, developers of housing for homeless individuals and other affordable housing have had the benefit of the Proposition H and Proposition HHH, Triple H funding that were enacted by the city and county a couple of years ago in an effort to attempt to address LA's enormous homeless crisis. So that's been an opportunity. There was a finding or an analysis anyway by the city attorney's office that money would be available to developers developing housing on this campus, even though we sit on a federal facility. So that's delightful. As that became available, though, more and more the developers who are looking to develop housing on our campus view that the Proposition H or Triple H funding as a necessary part of their funding package. And that money is both finite and doled out in relatively small bits at various points on the calendar. So the dependency on that money necessarily constrains the timeliness with which the developers can get their funding together and use it to deliver housing, which is simply a reality, and I'm not asking anybody in this room to figure out how to fix it, but I do believe we probably have not thought through every possibility for innovative additional funding sources. And so I would ask this group to think about how you might help us to be innovative.
Someone has entered the conference.
So that we can assist our developers in looking to all potential funding sources so we can deliver more housing more quickly than if we remain overly dependent on the Proposition H and Triple H funding or any other particular individual funding stream. Another thing that has come up that's kind of interesting has to do with different entities and different funding sources definition of a veteran. So I am told that there is some state funding that is generally available that carries with it a definition of veteran that is much broader than the definition that VA is required by law to use to identify veterans who are eligible for VA health care. And let me kind of pose the issue for you in a very direct way. One of the strongest arguments in favor of building housing for homeless veterans on this campus is that co-locating housing for those individuals with the VA healthcare facility improves their access to healthcare and thereby improves their healthcare outcomes. If we have veterans living on this campus who are not eligible for VA healthcare, a bit of that argument falls apart. But, as I understand it, if we do not permit in any way, shape, or form, if it's a strict prohibition against veterans living in housing on our campus, if they are not healthcare eligible, then some of that funding may not be available to the developers. So the question I've asked in my mind is a simple answer to that to prioritize healthcare eligible homeless veterans higher than non-healthcare eligible homeless veterans, but not strictly prohibit the placement of a ladder on this campus. Is that enough of a concession to make development on this campus eligible for that state funding? I don't know the answer to that question, but these are some of the nuances that we need to talk about. I'm happy to take questions as I go. And I'm going to grab my water while I listen.
Just when you're on this point, I know Vets' distinction is whether they were deployed. Is the VA's distinction the degree of deployment, or is it a different distinction?
It is both the length of service and the character of discharge.
Okay. Donna Deutschman, for the record, is it other than honorable and the honorable discharge?
It's not quite that simple, but in essence, yes.
In essence.
Yeah. And so, no, as I understand it, and I've had a very in-depth conversation with Steve Peck of US Vets, a member of our principal developer team, about this issue. He is far more knowledgeable about the state definition and about the sub-cohort, the number of homeless veterans who would be eligible under the state criteria but are not VA healthcare eligible. It's not a large number, but it's a very needy population, obviously. So I think we have to be thoughtful about how we approach this, and as I said, it may be as simple as establishing priority categories and not prohibiting the placement of non-healthcare eligible veterans on the campus, but giving those who are healthcare eligible a higher priority. Simply because co-locating them with their healthcare obviously improves their access and, at least theoretically, their healthcare outcomes as well. Whereas the non-VA healthcare eligible veterans would have to leave the campus to go get healthcare somewhere else.
And those grants, just from my knowledge, those grants would not be included if you only included VA healthcare veterans.
I don't know the answer to that. I can tell you that Steve Peck was concerned that they may in fact be precluded if we had a hard and fast black and white rule, thou shalt not be permitted to live in housing here unless the VA definition applies.
I would challenge that assumption.
I would love for you to challenge that assumption. But either way, these are things we need to sort through, and this is only one sort of misalignment of definitions that has been brought to my attention. I'm sure there are others.
Yeah, because if it's multifamily funding, which I would assume it is from HCD, Housing and Community Development, that's not correct.
Okay, excellent. So this is, I'm so glad I brought this up. So you can help us sort it through. Excellent.
I have a question.
Yes.
Howard Hernandez. I know we skipped over, it was on the last, here it is. Second question, what structure is appropriate for community governance, homeowners associations, and neighborhood councils? Now, are you referring to the surrounding area that is not part?
We're talking about self-governance of the veterans living in the community on our campus.
Okay, and not homeowners association.
Well, we've used that term actually in a different way, and let me pause for a minute there. We will have in the future multiple developers and multiple service providers all having equities on the North Campus. We will also still have some VA activities going on the North Campus. All of those bodies, to include VA, will have a shared interest in and responsibility for shared infrastructure, for example. And so I could see, it's not truly a homeowners association, but for want of a better term, I could see the need for governance among all of those leaseholders and VA as the landlord, and probably representation by and among the tenant groups living on the campus to talk about issues of common interest. Whether you call that a homeowners association or anything else, that's sort of what we envision will be needed.
Resident association.
Beautiful.
Okay. Now, and so far as the finances are concerned, I know we had a presentation in January regarding the Chip-In Act.
Yes.
And it's my understanding that it's going to be sunsetting sometime in May or June.
Yes, and was never going to be available for housing anyway.
But it would be available for other.
It is sunsetting. We do have several West LA projects that are in the SCIP, the Strategic Capital Improvement Plan. You have to be in the SCIP in order to be eligible for the Chip-In Act, and then you have to, through some sort of magic, find a donor that wants to donate money to it. We have done the former, things are in the SCIP. We don't have a donor.
Okay, but now, do you have any knowledge as to whether or not they're going to be extending the Chip-In Act?
I don't know.
Are you advocating an extension of the Chip-In Act?
I don't know what VA's position is. I frankly don't know. That's beyond my realm. I'm sorry. Paul, do you happen to know? Paul doesn't know either.
I'll get it. What did Jeff shoot?
Hi, Megan. Hi, thank you for this update. This is great. My one comment about, I think it's this slide, the questions and discussion topics around naming, branding, engaging with the community, those sorts of things. I think those fall directly in line with the recommendation that we submitted to be approved tomorrow around change in communications, in particular getting resources dedicated here for that function. And so I think that these are the type of activities that can be added into that scope of work. And so as those come up for tomorrow, just wanted to bring that up.
Sure, excellent. So the comment, did everybody hear him? I think the answer is yes. All right, I barely could, but they did. All right. Yes.
Thanks, Megan, for the presentation. It's Rob Begla for the record. On the discussion about how the VA should work with the principal developer to talk about the sorting of housing, I have two thoughts for the group. The first thought is, I think we ought to get presentations from people who are regarded as having either with their research or their methods established the best practices in the permanent supportive housing business. Whether it's RAND, whether it's UCLA, I think we ought to have people who have studied empirically the outcomes get up and present to us. And I think that ought to be the direction that you give and that the VA gives. The second thought, which is related, is I think that because of the size of the hospital here, it's easy to allow considerations of a medical nature to predominate. And so, for example, while I'm sympathetic and understanding of the need to, for example, make housing decisions based on acuity of care or mobility, I do not want to see those predominate. Because I could easily see if medical service outcomes came to predominate, we would sacrifice the success of the homelessness mission. Yeah, and I bet all of us around the table could imagine different scenarios in which we'd argue for one value versus the other. And I think, for me, the thing that will persuade me, and I hope persuade the group, is just empirical evidence. What are the best practices in permanent supportive housing?
Right.
And I've heard friends tell me what they think the best is. I'd love to hear it from Rand, for example, or someone else that's really done longitudinal studies.
Yeah, absolutely. I think if there's any upside to the longevity and scope and breadth of the homelessness crisis here in Los Angeles, it's that there is the data's there. It's been done. People have been housing homeless people in and around Southern California for a long time. Some of them very successfully. Others perhaps iterated themselves into success, but probably tried a few things that actually were not as successful. So I absolutely agree with you.
And just to finish the thought, I know that the developers have the best interests in mind, but in the end, they're being paid to do work.
Yep.
That is a different task than us, who are being asked to figure out what's the best possible outcome for veterans.
Absolutely.
And so I think this board has to think about being an advocate for what is the right mix for permanent supportive housing. You know, what's the age distribution you want? You want it to be co-ed versus single sex? Do you want it ranging across different conflicts?
Right. I would just add one other thought to that, which is that we know that individual veterans' needs change over time. So if somebody comes to live on this campus and their physical and mental health is good enough that they can't live independently in permanent supportive housing, and then in the fullness of time their health erodes, their mental health status changes, and they can't live independently, we don't want that person to have to go elsewhere to get their needs met. So we need to think not just about the needs of individuals when they arrive, but their needs changing over time.
Donna Deutschman?
Yes, I want to absolutely applaud what Bob said. Donna Deutschman for the record. That's hard for me, I'll get used to it. But I do want to applaud what he said, and I want to reiterate that tomorrow we have a recommendation to be voted on that also supports that concept and requires that deliberation on best practices and research into best practices, and requires that report out to the secretary, and that the developer utilize those best practices in developing these services. And also, what you just said, Megan, in developing the appropriate veteran-centric modifications, such as lighting, such as aging-in-place modifications that are absolutely out there and exist for veterans as they age over time. And so this has to be a recommendation, and it has to be our obligation as we're doing this to make sure that those report outs go longitudinally also, that they don't stop being made to the public and to the secretary. I think that we're probably gonna run a little bit over on this, so you asked some specific questions. And I wanted to just give you some feedback on the record. With regard to H and HH running out, that may or may not happen, but I do want to say that there are other funding sources, and so for the record, I will list them, since you asked for it.
We do have a note taker.
Minutes.
Okay, go ahead.
So, of course, there are new market tax credits, which is a very large source of funding. The VHHP has been expanded, that's Veteran Housing and Homeless Program. Obviously, what I mentioned before, Housing and Community Development has multifamily housing, they just got a huge allotment, so that will go on for a number of years. I don't believe this is an opportunity zone, but there's a new kind of funding known as the opportunity zone that involves private investors. They would have to check to see, given that this is West LA, I doubt it is. LISC, L-I-S-C, is a loan source for low-income housing, multifamily in particular. Genesis is also a low-cost loan source for multifamily housing and other low-income housing. And there's a new form of funding that foundations are doing, known as the PRI, Program-Related Investment. So all of those are becoming available, and stitched together, I think they'll be more than abundant for this program. And then the other note that I wanted to make in terms of the culture of the neighborhood. I met about 2 weeks ago with Lindsay Sin, who's the deputy in charge of women and families, and overseeing the VHHP program. One of the things that they're noticing about permanent supportive housing is that unless if there's attention by the developer to creating a neighborhood feel and giving power through that HOA or residents association, and getting the neighbors to know each other and to interact together, that there has been problems with violence. And that's been a big difference between neighborhoods. So I just wanted to put that into the mix of information.
I appreciate that. It's a lot of thoughtful comments, and I really appreciate it. I want to flag one other thing about evolving veteran needs, just so I don't forget. And that is, as Dr. Davis pointed out earlier, there are programs and stipends available in VA to support caregivers. And one of the things that a veteran who is no longer able to live independently may need is an in-home caregiver. So if we are building only studio and one-bedroom apartment units, we may not be allowing for that flexibility as veterans age and need a caregiver. We need to make sure that we built that into sort of the architectural decisions, if you will. I think Howard's got
Howard Hernandez.
Yes, Howard Hernandez. You know, I'm excited about it, really I am. I'd really like to be more excited insofar as your announcements that are going to be held out in June. And I would wonder whether or not between now and June, perhaps we may be able to sit in and just observe or listen to what type of negotiation that you're making insofar as the presentation that will be presented in June, because we'd like to see whether or not the milestones and the goals are going to be presented at that point in time. Because our next meeting is probably not going to be scheduled until July or August, and sort of like to get a head start insofar as where everything's going.
Sure. So I think the right thing to do, perhaps on an upcoming call and information exchange, is to get a sense that, frankly, I don't personally have as I'm standing here, of exactly what level of detail goes into the record of decision, which is the document that will be published in late June. And so I think perhaps getting at least a subcommittee of this group up to speed on that process, so you know what to expect and exactly when the opportunities are to help us move to a more detailed conversation. We'll get you that information, because frankly, I don't have it as I'm standing here.
Hi, Jeff Shear, follow up real quick. Along those lines, I think it was on the previous slide, but around community planning and the feasibility study and cost of the different options that they're coming up with. And I would hope that they're thinking through, and I think this is to Bob's point as well, the service portfolio and what are all the services that are going to be needed, and so that way we have a holistic viewpoint on it, and then we can start to make tough decisions around what are we gonna pay for, what can we not afford, and then figure out how can we raise the funds necessary to do that. And so what I would ask on a future meeting to talk about where we're at with that, and if you guys need support on helping to, understand, figure that out as well.
Yeah, and thank you, I appreciate that. I will share that, at least my observation as the principal developer team has sort of been presenting very preliminary ideas. Again, it's too early in the process for them to be anything other than ideas, but their approach is quite holistic and absolutely built around what is that entire array of services that will be required to help these veterans thrive and to build that sense of community. So I really look forward to a time when we can have the principal developer team themselves come here and sort of present and hear from you as well. I'm going to move on just to make sure I get through all of my stuff, and then I'll take more questions. Talked about funding. The one last thing that I wanted to flag here, and we've talked about this a lot in the past, and that is that as our enhanced use leasing statute is currently written, it's an open question whether we could include in the mix market rate housing for those veterans who may want to live on campus and can't afford to pay something like market rate rent. So for example, if in addition to 1,200 or more units of permanent supportive housing, if we chose in the future to look into building housing for senior veterans who may benefit from being co-located with their health care, but who can't afford to pay rent, that would certainly bring additional money into the community to help to sustain and maintain the infrastructure. And so right now, I don't know that anybody believes strongly that we have the statutory authority to do that. I don't know if it's a good idea either, but I think it's something that as we're planning for 20 or 25 years into the future, we ought to be thinking about. Because when I look at certain parts of this campus and the views available from them, I could certainly see veterans of some means being willing to pay to live here if that were an opportunity for them. Want to talk a little bit about the enterprise district, because as I said, I think it's an opportunity that nobody really has owned. So this has been a part of our master plan sort of refinement that I think has gotten the least care and attention, and yet it is an urgent need among veterans, particularly homeless veterans, who need additional opportunities to build their job skills and perhaps to incubate their job ideas. There's a whole lot of richness in the one or two paragraphs in the draft master plan that describe conceptually what the enterprise and cultural district will look like. And I think we have some opportunities for quick wins. We will need partners, and we will need ideas, and we will need people willing to link the ideas and the partners, and then to push things and sort of blow on the beginning to glow embers till we get something that ignites. I wasn't sure until I got the end of that, whether that metaphor was going to work.
It did.
It did. Okay, good. So one of the things that I wanted to plant here, we do have a lot of data. Our SIRS, community engagement and what does SIRS stand for?
Reintegration.
Thank you. Reintegration service has an employment service within it. And those folks interact with homeless veterans every day around their needs in terms of the jobs they would like to have if only they could get the certifications and the training that would make them eligible for them. I flagged 4 general topics here that are the ones that in which there seems to be the highest interest and also many opportunities. That's around food service, security, so guard jobs, office and administrative jobs, and transportation drivers. It would be delightful if we could get some partners onto the campus to provide some sort of training that results in certification in food safety, for example, preparing food in a way that allows you to work in a large food service job. And I know that there are lots of partners in the community that would love to do that. We've got some space, not a lot of space, that on our campus right now that could probably be repurposed to host such a thing without a whole lot of difficulty. And so what I would like to see is, let's not let perfect be the enemy of done. Let's think of a few things we can do quickly. Let's find some partners to come in and do them as sort of a proof of concept. We iterate as we go, and we sort of build it a little bit at a time. Because I really do believe that we can get a lot done in a hurry in this regard. We have a member of the public with a hand up. I'm not sure whether that's kosher.
Sorry?
CBED member, as a CBED member,
Ma'am. Do you have a public comment, public comment session? Thank you.
Or I can catch you at break. Okay. All right, so the two sort of overarching questions that come out of this slide are what partnering opportunities are you aware of? As I said, there are lots of entities in the community who do the things that our veterans need. And so the question is engaging with them and then also ensuring that we have enough input from veterans. We know what the veterans who our SERS teams engage with want, but there are other veterans as well. Are there particular needs of veterans who aren't homeless but perhaps are at risk because their earning potential is too low? And how do we make sure that the needs of all veterans in the greater Los Angeles area come into the conversation so that we're building the right programs that help as many people as may need it?
Megan, this is Liz Davis. Is this something that it would be helpful if this committee addressed things like metrics for determining an impact in the enterprise district? As you look at employment certification, is there a cost curve that needs to be calculated in? Is there the best practice issue that Rob has raised that we need to make sure that we're, addressing here, even in things that are non-healthcare?
Yes, and in the early going, I would love the input of this group and anybody else who wants to play in identifying what questions should we set up as we set up a proof of concept. How will we know if even that little first thing that we're doing is working well enough to continue? So I think there's an opportunity for those metrics, big picture, long term, but also interim metrics to know whether something is worth continuing to invest in, even if it's just beginning and therefore not necessarily operating as effectively as you would want it to over time. Yes, okay. Finally, I want to talk a bit about our IG report. I think it's finally. Nope, two things. All right, so I need to time myself appropriately. We have spoken before about the IG land use audit that came out in September of 2018, and for which our final plan to address the recommendations must be implemented by the end of September of this year. We have been looking, so I want to flag two things, because people seem to mix them up as if they were the same, and they're not. There are two major types of land use agreements that have been used on this campus. One is called a revocable license, which is generally shorter term. It's not a recordable interest. It does not generally result in the payment of rent. And if it does result in the payment of rent or a license fee, that money has to go to the U.S. Treasury because it is not subject to the provision in the West LA Leasing Act that says lease revenues stay with this property for and can be used for the renovation and maintenance of the land and buildings. So that's a revocable license, usually shorter term. It's usually a non-exclusive use of a particular part of the campus and doesn't generally result in the payment of rent. And if it did, that rent doesn't work to the benefit of veterans. If we have a proposal from a third party to have a revocable license on this campus, because that's not covered by the West LA Leasing Act, it is the draft master plan that dictates what the services to veterans must be. And the draft master plan says that all land uses will be will benefit veterans, will be veteran focused or veteran centric. I think those terms are used interchangeably. The other generally used type of land use agreement is called a lease. And there are three different types that are all authorized by our West LA Leasing Act. The first is an enhanced use lease, which is the mechanism that we use to build housing for homeless veterans. The second is what I call a services lease. It's a different paragraph in the law, and it says that VA can lease land or buildings to a third party to provide services that principally benefit veterans and their families. And the law articulates what that phrase means. And it can't just be through the generation of lease revenues. It has to be services that are either exclusively for veterans or that meet a particular need of veterans and their families such that any benefit to the public is just incidental to it. There may be other words in the statute, but that's generally what it says. Then there's another paragraph in the statute that authorizes a lease to the Regents of the University of California with a whole bunch of caveats that have to be met in order for that lease to be authorized under the statute. The statute also allows for easements and other things, but I won't bore you with that. So, as we've been looking at the land uses that the IG flagged as deficient, we looked first at what was the deficiency that was noted. In some cases, documentation had simply expired, and the IG had no particular concern about the nature of the use, but just said, you need documentation that is in effect, so clean up your act from a documentation perspective. Others were revocable licenses that, according to the IG, did not meet the draft master plans requirement that land uses be veteran-focused or veteran-centric. And then there was also a concern in the IG's report about the Brentwood School lease. And I want to go into what we've been doing to address the IG's deficiencies based on what type of land use it is and what the nature of the deficiency was that they flagged, because it's a different approach for each. I am going to get into some detail, and so I think for this part, I'd ask you, let me get to the end of it, and then I'll take questions about all of it, just because otherwise I think I'll be here forever. So there were several, as I said, land uses, most of them, all of them, licenses rather than leases where the documentation had expired, but the IG had no particular issue with the nature of the use. Those are easy. You just get new documentation in place, and that's what we've been working to do. That's the easiest one. The second was those revocable licenses, and I want to keep calling them that because it's important to note that by their nature, they are revocable by the department. They are easy to terminate on purpose, and that's why revocable is in their name. Those that could in some way be cured by adding significant additional benefit to veterans, we looked at whether the license holder was willing to do those things that would make them meet the requirements of the draft master plan. If they couldn't be, and there were a few where the IG specifically said the principal purpose of this, for example, I'll use the Shakespeare Center of Los Angeles. Shakespeare Center is a wonderful program. They did some great things for veterans, and their main focus in being on this campus was to put on Shakespeare plays for which the public paid quite a bit of money for their seats, although they did provide free tickets to veterans and their caregivers. So it was one of those things where it kind of depended on your point of view, but the IG said, no. Their real purpose in being here was to put on Shakespeare plays for the public, and that you can't cure that because that's their principal purpose. So we did revoke that license. As I want to make it clear to this group, as we did, frankly, in the letter terminating that license, there were benefits to veterans. It's just hard to overcome the fact that public tickets cost $500 to $1,500 a piece. And so it sure looked like something other than a program put on principally to benefit veterans. So that's an example. I'm trying to think of some others. I think that's probably the clearest one. Now let's talk about leases. And I want to flag a couple of other things as well before we get into exactly what we're doing with the Brentwood School lease. There are a couple of documents that also sort of drive what we do on this campus. One was the settlement agreement that Secretary McDonald signed to settle the Valentini litigation. And in the settlement agreement, the parties agreed to work together to identify an exit strategy for non-compliant land uses, and that the document itself talked about we were going to look at litigated risk, cost to the government, and not wanting to deprive veterans of benefits and services they needed. So those are sort of three driving overarching principles: litigated risk, cost to the government, and making sure that necessary services for veterans continue. The same general three-part strategy is in the draft master plan, that as we are looking at what we're going to do with third-party land uses, we are looking at litigative risk, cost, and service to veterans. So, the IG's findings with respect to the Brentwood School lease were based on largely a legal argument that there's an overarching government-wide statute. I don't remember exactly what the citation is, but it's in the IG report, that says that a lease in the federal government can only be supported by monetary consideration. You can't accept in-kind consideration for a lease under that overarching statute. Then there is a VA-wide statute that's in Title 38 that says the secretary can accept certain types of in-kind consideration for a lease. Then there is the West LA Leasing Act that in some respects is directly in conflict with both the overarching government-wide statute and the general VA outleasing statute. And there is a legal, the school of thought about interpreting statutes that are inconsistent with each other is that both the most specific and the last enacted controls. So we have the latest enacted of those three statutes is the West LA Leasing Act. It applies solely to this campus, and it is in material respects in conflict with the other two statutes. But because Congress doesn't always do us a favor, the West LA Leasing Act doesn't specifically say that those other two statutes don't apply on this campus. I think the best argument to be made is that Congress intended it not to apply because it enacted a more specific and later statute that is in conflict with the other two. But anyway, so the IG's findings about the Brentwood School lease were based in part on their argument that the consideration that's spelled out in the Brentwood School lease was illegal under both that government-wide statute and the general VA statute. And so the department's response to that finding was, I think you got it wrong on the law. Don't think those other two statutes were intended to apply to a lease on this campus. Also, from a practical perspective, if you look at the Brentwood School lease and you look at the legal effect of an IG finding, the Brentwood School lease was signed off on by the then VA secretary based on his decision informed by the analysis of the VA Office of General Counsel that the Brentwood School lease, as renegotiated, was consistent with the West LA Leasing Act. There is also language in a committee report that the House Veterans Affairs Committee issued in connection with one of the bills that became the West LA Leasing Act, in which the committee, which was aware of the negotiations going into that new lease, said they believed that the new lease would be consistent with the statute that they were moving to enact. So that's what we call some legislative intent, legislative history, indicating Congress was aware of the terms that were being renegotiated. You put all that together, and I'm a lawyer. I don't think we win the litigation if we were to terminate the Brentwood School lease based on the finding of the IG. I think both because the IG got the legal analysis wrong, and because there is an indication in the legislative history that Congress intended the services lease aspect of the statute to be broad enough to cover that lease, I think we lose in litigation. If we won, by the way, first of all, it would take a while, several years, but if we won, we would likely win the right to pay Brentwood School for a high school athletic facility that they built in 1997 at a cost of $17 million. I don't know what it would be worth today, but more. And so that's money we don't have to procure a high school athletic facility that we don't need and certainly can't afford to maintain. All of that together has led to the recommendation by the people looking at this, which includes the Office of General Counsel, folks on up to and including leadership of the department, that the right thing to do right now is to negotiate much more veteran benefiting consideration into that lease rather than attempt to terminate it. So that's the direction we're going. And I wanted you to know why. Okay, questions about that? I do want to get to the last question on, well, actually, let me get to this last question and then I'll answer questions, if that's okay. So one thing that I do want to make sure we are getting from this group and all other stakeholder groups to the full extent that we can is assistance in understanding what services veterans prioritize most. We have lots of inputs. We do surveys all the time. We have inputs from the folks who work with homeless veterans through SERS. We have folks who work with homeless and at-risk veterans in the domiciliary treatment facilities. We have lots of input, but we don't have all the input. And so I do want to make sure that we get the benefit of your thinking about how do we make sure that we have the voices of all veterans in the mix as we negotiate with any third party for services to veterans. All right, now I'm prepared to take questions.
Jeff Shear. Go ahead, Donna, I'm sorry, Donna Deutsch.
Donna Deutschman for the record. I do want to say that we have a recommendation to the secretary regarding how to select facilities based on the West LA Leasing Act. I also want to support Megan. Thank you for that full description and understanding. And I just want to say to the committee, in my opinion, another overarching reason that supports this decision is that as a committee, I believe that our goal is to get housing for veterans on this campus. And any other decision would have likely, in my opinion, led to an enormous long-term legal battle that would have prohibited us from moving forward with our ultimate goal. And I think that this is a necessary step, and I think it's the right decision. We have got to move ahead with housing for our veterans.
I do want to flag one other thing that is also, I think, pertinent, and I forgot to say it. So when we asked the principal developer to come up with recommendations about a community plan, we gave them a map of the campus with very few sections marked as out of bounds. In other words, not available to them even to think about building housing. One of the places that is unavailable to them is the Cal-Vet home, because that was deeded away to the state. And another is the area where the columbarium is being expanded. Both the UCLA stadium area, I'm sorry, Christy, and the Brentwood School parcel were in play for the are in play for the principal developer team to consider building housing on. If they believed that either place was a good, efficient, cost-effective place to build housing and incorporate it into a larger community. What we have now is a very preliminary view from them, but I will just note for the record that they have not targeted the Brentwood School area or the UCLA area for housing at this time, in large part because of the terrain of the campus and the difficulty in getting to both of those places from the area where most of the housing will be. So it would be harder to integrate together a neighborhood that includes parcels that you can't get to from one another. So I do want to throw that out there, that there is no current recommendation even to build housing where Brentwood School currently has its facility, or whatever that may be with.
Jeff Shear.
Yeah, Jeff Shear, thank you, Megan. A few items that I'll try to go through really quickly. First, I know that Donna has drafted a recommendation that will be submitted for approval tomorrow around principally veteran focused and actually defining what that means. It's very vague and ambiguous at this point.
And that's the definition in the draft master plan, not the definition in the statute?
It's the definition, it utilizes the statute and the master plan together. You'll see it tomorrow.
Okay, I'm only flagging that I'm not sure that this committee or the secretary, based on the recommendation of this committee, could very area definition that Congress imposed by statute, but I'll.
Yeah, no, it goes back to the original wording of the statute.
Okay,
You'll see that the definitions that you were talking about are in there from the original document.
got it,
Yeah.
okay.
So just to tee that up, essentially. And then, along the other lines, thank you, you did a great job of, walking us through all the different ways to rent out land on this campus. And I'm still confused after 18 months of hearing it over and over again. And I think my broader point is it's very confusing.
Yeah.
And so another recommendation that we're putting forward tomorrow is around a content management system, basically a website that will be public or veteran facing.
Oh.
That would break
Wait
that.
till this afternoon, and we'll show you.
Correct.
Already out there.
And so, and the idea here is that to make that actionable, so to break that down and simplify it and then make it actionable and giving people, visibility and transparency of where they're at in the process. If they're trying to say, rent a piece of land to have a nonprofit event on the campus, right now people are confused and they don't know what to do. And so it's a big kind of issue in the community that doesn't need to be addressed. So that was the second thing. The last thing, input of voices of veterans to understand services and needs. I think to hit on Dr. Davis and the great work that the Veteran Experience Office does, and also like this is what I do professionally as well. And so there's designers are great at this, and the VA and other federal agencies around customer experience are using more design into understanding kind of unmet needs, and then using those unmet needs to really drive kind of recommendations around policy, around kind of different digital assets and tools, and also service design as well. So I think that using those kind of resources, also the mayor's office, the innovation office was brought up earlier. I know that they use this approach as well. So it's happening across the country, and so there are kind of methodologies to help you guys address that.
Awesome. All right, I'm gonna plow through my last slide. Do I have time?
Yeah.
All right, is this my last slide? Yes, it is, before this afternoon. So Dr. Davis mentioned before, and I think you have handouts about the Mission Act. I am not an expert in the Mission Act, and so I only want to bring it up by way of flagging for this group two things that are going on, and one is required, the other is authorized, but I don't know that required by the Mission Act, that may impact what goes on this campus. And so I would just ask for you to think about whether there is the potential for this group to make a recommendation to the secretary around either of these two things. So one thing that is required is something called a market assessment that looks at the extent to which veterans in the catchment area of a particular VA facility can, on average, get to a primary care appointment in 30 minutes or less, or to a specialty care appointment in 60 minutes or less. We laugh about it, but it's not funny. For most of us, at most hours of the workday, you can only get to this hospital in 30 minutes or less if you live in the parking lot. And so that has enormous implications potentially for healthcare at this facility over time. Another thing that I want to flag, because I have asked the question but have not yet received from anybody in the VA central office, part of the org chart that has responsibility for carrying out those market assessments across the country, is how do we account for things like the future opening on this campus of the Purple Line? If we had fast rail service onto this campus from downtown so that you could routinely and consistently and reliably get here from downtown in 17 minutes, which I think is what Purple Line says will be the travel time, how does that change our market assessment? And we have a certain and set timeline from LA Metro around getting the Purple Line onto this campus. A little bit more nebulous, but still coming, is what LA Metro has planned as the Sepulveda Transit Corridor, which will bring service from the western part of the San Fernando Valley down past this campus to the airport and beyond. Probably not connecting right here, but probably connecting at Wilshire and Westwood, which would again change dramatically travel times for veterans coming to this facility, either from the West Valley or from the South Bay or anywhere in between. So does the market assessment, if in fact it's going to drive long-term planning of VA healthcare, does it take into account known improvements in mass transportation? And if it doesn't, should it? It's an open question, but I think you probably know which way I fall on that question. So I just want to flag that for you because it is something that is very critically important to the long-term planning process for VA healthcare facilities right now. And I think we've got some open questions. One about the coming of the Purple Line and other improvements in the LA Metro system. The second about the fact that this property was purposely deeded to provide housing and healthcare to veterans. And so should there be any recommendations about how either the market assessment or the air commission, which I'll talk about in a minute, can and should be carried out with respect to this particular campus. The air commission, again, I'm not a Mission Act specialist, so if there are information in your handouts that suggest that what I'm about to say is wrong, I will defer to the handouts. But we do know that the Mission Act also authorizes the president to set up something called an asset inventory commission, something like that. Infrastructure commission that, like the BRAC before it and the old VA Cares Commission, I think is intended to look at whether VA healthcare facilities are in the right place, whether they're right-sized, and whether the infrastructure that VA currently has in terms of its healthcare facilities is the right infrastructure for a future VA that perhaps has more, a better blend of community and VA healthcare being provided so that veterans can get to their appointments in a better timing than Jeff described earlier. And so again, what are the implications of something like an air commission recommendation, which could very well say that the West LA campus of the Greater Los Angeles healthcare system is in exactly the right place and it's exactly the right size, or it could say something other than that. How does any of that play with a property like this one that was purposefully deeded for veteran housing and healthcare? And what does any of that do to our commitment and the congressional authorization that we carry out the commitment in the draft master plan? The West LA Act authorizes us to do that. I would argue it is also a very clear indicator of Congress's intent that we will do that. So I don't know how any of that plays out, but these are things on the horizon, and I think provide some pretty good fodder for this group to think about recommendations to the Secretary about the future of this healthcare facility and the housing that would co-locate veterans with that healthcare facility. All right, that's all I got. Any more questions?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Davis. Megan, on the first one, when you talked about you're modifying existing lease agreements per the IG, and these are the easy and simple ones because of expiration dates. Or do you want to give any EGs or any examples of those?
Gosh, what are we? Somebody in the room help me. What are the ones that expired and we're redoing them? And we are redoing them. One that we're looking at that's an easy one is the credit union that has the ATM down the hall here. That agreement expired, and we need to document why there's somebody else's. It's not somebody else's. It's actually, well, there are two. There's one that's associated with this VISN, and then another associated with UCLA, because we have so many UCLA residents and folks coming through that, as a convenience to them, their ATM is also here. That's one. I mean, most of them are very benign, which is why the IG only flagged the fact that the document was expired, didn't say anything about the nature of the use.
And if the committee needs additional information on the Mission Act based on this last slide, in order, for any reason, we will.
Yeah, I would encourage this group to think about getting a fulsome briefing.
We will provide that, and we can even provide it in a variety of ways.
Right. Including on a phone call, so people don't have to
Right.
wait till the next.
Right.
Okay, other questions?
Finally, I would mention that, related to the comment about the voice of the veteran on the prior slide 6, we can certainly, the committee can certainly request, and so can the campus, obviously, we can use our veteran signals to get real-time feedback from any community groups or any individual veterans here voluntarily, and get that information analyzed and back to the committee or to GLA, which is already receiving other types of information right away.
I will
without
also
cost.
just flag to whet your appetite for later today, we're gonna be showing you the new master plan website that we have built that is very different, it's a lot easier to navigate, and it's much easier for us to update, so an improvement in every possible way. It also has an increasingly robust survey tool seeking all kinds of input from veterans about the services they want and do receive on this campus. And in our most meta way, we're also using the survey to improve the survey. And so we'd love it, and we'll show you this afternoon how you can take the survey, and among the things we would love to see in your responses is how to make it a better survey. But that's a pretty easy way, and so we built it into the website, but we've also got paper copies that we're handing out at every event on the campus that brings a lot of people here, which is old school, but it seems to work because people grab them and fill them out, so. All right, I think I will stop there and I can answer other questions. I'm on your agenda 3 times, so you're never gonna get rid of me, so I'll answer other questions then.
Megan, as always, thank you very much for your informative briefing.